I'm Saundra Kelley, and I'm reading from Jacqueline Brunais' book, On the Drop Side of Yonder. It's been a wonderful journey through her words back through time. This chapter, 11, is about strange and wonderful relatives. Don't we all have them? You just listen. I remember the time I spent the night with my Aunt Elisha. She was really my mother's aunt, my great-aunt, and having no children of her own, she was particularly fond of my mother, who had followed her choice of profession, that of country school teacher. Elisha is the aunt my mother boarded with when the first year she taught, right before she met my dad. Aunt Elisha was married to her third husband after having been widowed twice. I was about 7 years old at the time of the visit. My grandparents and uncles and aunts lived up north, and we lived 280 miles south, and usually saw those relatives only once a year. Aunt Elisha, a large woman with pale skin, pink cheeks, and thick ankles, came to her brother's, my grandfather's house to visit with my parents, and they were the company. She invited my cousin Billy, who lived near our grandfather, and me to spend the night at her house. Billy, 2 years older than I, had spent a couple of days playing happily on Grandpa's farm, and some barrels were lying on their sides affixed to a platform, and they made perfect horses as we played cowboys. Both of us are fans of Tom Mix, Ken Maynard, and Gene Autry, the movie Cowboys, and it sounded to me as if it might be okay to go to Aunt Elisha's overnight, as long as we were together. Billy agreed to go, except at the last minute he went over to his mother, sat on her lap, and whined that he was not going. My mother said, "Jackie will go alone then." I knew if I backed out, I would be letting her down. But I dreaded spending the night in a strange place with people I hardly knew. I was furious with Billy. Gene Autry would have been ashamed of the big sissy. We drove far out into the country. Darkness was coming on, and the cows still had to be rounded up and milked. There was no such thing as a streetlight anywhere as we traveled to the small log cabin surrounded by woods out in the country. Uncle Ben invited me to help him find 5 cows which roamed the woods, and both he and Aunt Elisha were very hard of hearing, and I was getting nervous over the impending darkness. And Uncle Ben, well, he seemed to be going in the opposite direction from the cowbells, and he asked for my assistance, and I was glad to help. I'm not sure if he really needed the help or he was just letting me feel important. Anyway, I was much relieved when the cows were safely in the barn and I was safely inside the cabin. I was still uneasy because the kerosene lamps seemed woefully inadequate. The corners were all dark and spooky. We had a simple supper, and then we went directly to bed. Aunt Elisha and I slept together, and Uncle Ben slept somewhere else. My aunt showed me the largest chamber pot I had ever seen, and she placed it directly under the bed. It was all white and shiny with raised flowers on the outside. I don't remember using it, so I must have made it through the night and then used the outdoor facility. I never felt so lonely and frightened in my whole life as that night, and it was that moment when Aunt Elisha went to sleep and began to snore so peacefully. Suddenly there were strange sounds overhead and all around us. They became louder and louder as creatures of some sort scampered all around us. The room, of course, was the darkest of dark. I couldn't sleep because of the racket from the unseen intruders. But eventually, of course, I did sleep. When morning dawned, all was quiet. Aunt Elisha had invited the rest of the family and my grandparents to dinner, and after breakfast she invited me to go with her to gather the eggs. The hens in the chicken coop resented the intrusion and began to cluck and protest. I've always been afraid of birds of all kinds, and that included chickens. I ran outside and waited for my aunt. Next, she said she planned to kill chickens to cook for dinner. She enlisted my help in catching them, but every time they ran in my direction to escape her, I screamed and ran away myself. She finally caught two, and then she did the most awful thing. She took a sharp knife, opened the poor creatures' beaks, and stuck the point of the knife down their throats, and hung them by the feet on the clothesline to drip blood and make the most horrible sounds. It still makes me sick to think about it. Now, she wasn't a cruel woman by nature, no. And I'm sure there was some reasoning behind her methods. But it was dreadful to watch. I was never so happy to see my family and grandparents drive in at noon. We had a pleasant dinner, but I could barely poke a piece of chicken down my throat. I played with my little brother while the grown-ups visited during the afternoon. Aunt Elisha invited my parents to spend the night, but only my mother and I stayed. I slept with my mother, and I wasn't afraid when I heard the night creatures begin their rampages. But the next day, when we were back at my grandparents' farm, I heard my mother tell my dad that rats ran through the house all night. She hadn't slept well and said she would have never let me stay there by myself if she had known. Apparently, neither Aunt Elisha nor Uncle Ben heard them, since both were partially deaf. I never forgot that sleepover, and when Aunt Elisha died within a few years, in her will she left me her watch and several pieces of depression glass, which I have to this day. One of Dad's brothers was kind of an oddball, but I liked him. He played country music on a guitar and was always nice to me. He had what one would call a one-track mind. For instance, one weekend he came from Toledo to visit us, and he talked about a new diet he was on. Essentially, it was just pineapple and cabbage. He wasn't just on the diet. He insisted on talking about it incessantly. Every turn of conversation led him back to pineapple and cabbage. The subject, its virtues, and also why the rest of the food people ate was unhealthy. And that's all he talked about. Another time he arrived with a set of false teeth and talked about them nonstop and insisted on taking them out. He displayed them to family and visitors alike the whole weekend. My mother's sister, Bernita, was born when their brother was 21. Mom was 14. I think Bernita must have been spoiled by everyone in the family, including the two grandparents who lived in the same house. She had a reputation in the family of being ornery and having an occasional mean streak. When my sisters and I acted snippy or contrary, my mother would say, "Now, Bernita." And when we and my brother were acting goofy, she would say, "Now, Uncle Keffer." We knew exactly what she meant, and it also meant for us to stop what we were doing. We were not being complimented, no. Now, I don't mean to imply that I suffered any scars from being called Bernita or Uncle Keffer. My mother praised our good behavior, she really did, and reinforced our positive images of ourselves in many ways. But my problem was my relationship with Bernita. She was pretty, not too much older than my sister, and so I wanted her to like me when I was a child. Most of the time, it didn't seem she actively disliked me, but I never felt that she really approved of me. The year I was 9, I was sent up north to stay with her husband, their 3-year-old daughter Joanne, and my grandfather for a month. I can't say Bernita was terribly mean to me, but I just never seemed to be able to please her. At the end of the month, my parents came to get me, but first they visited other relatives. And for those couple of hours, they left me and my brother, age 7, with Bernita. Bernita went into the house and got her camera. And taking a lot of photographs was not a routine thing in the post-Depression era. Usually it was usual for people on special occasions. But on this day, Bernita said, "Elwyn, you and Joanne go and sit on the steps by the side door, and I'll take your picture." That's exactly what she did. I stood silently by, wishing that I had been included. The scar from that slight burned for the rest of my childhood. It's a funny thing. After I grew up, she seemed to like me just fine, but she wasn't too fond of my younger sister, Joyce. Poor Joyce suffered the misfortune of having her for a teacher in one of the elementary grades. But Joyce seemed able to blow off Bernita's snide remarks without much trouble, and really even considered her to be a good teacher. One of my nieces even said that Bernita was the best teacher she ever had. On the first day of school, when Bernita taught in Joyce's room, she informed Joyce nastily that if she thought she was going to get special treatment, she could just get that out of her head. On another occasion, when Joyce was at her house, Bernita told my sister admonishingly, "Don't throw our toilet paper down the hall." There was no indoor plumbing at the time. And Joyce said it would never have occurred to her to throw the toilet paper down the hole. I have to add the postscript that something good came out of my aunt's slight, which wounded me so much. I've always been conscious of the feelings of children, and have tried never to show favoritism. If it came to my favorites, I would choose Uncle Keffer. The first and only time I met Aunt Laurie was the day the front door opened and in walked an old woman who could have played the movie role of an ancient witch walked in. She was humpbacked, the way many old women are when their bones are deficient in calcium, and perhaps other ingredients required by the body to maintain a healthy old age. I happened to be visiting my parents at the time, and I was startled. No one locked the door in those days, and it was not unusual for someone to walk in. But I had never seen that diminutive woman dressed all in black. "Aunt Laurie!" my mother exclaimed as she ran towards her, and they embraced warmly. Now I understood. This was the woman who was not really an aunt by blood. She was my mother's aunt, had died while still a young woman. Her husband, Uncle Jonathan, had married Aunt Laurie. She reared his 5 children and became the mother of one more. They had lived in northern Michigan near my grandparents before moving to Iowa many years later. And my mother had not seen Aunt Laurie for more than 25 years. In the meantime, Uncle Jonathan had passed away, and Aunt Laurie had come one more time to visit a daughter, and she said she couldn't leave Michigan without stopping to see my mother. I found her to be a delightful, caring, vivacious person, full of love for all those she spoke of, both living and dead. And after she left, my mother began to reminisce. Uncle Jonathan had been a pious person, and according to my mother, he had spent hours each day praying that the farm would prosper, and the crops would thrive, and the cows would produce milk, and his animals bring a good price at the market. Aunt Laurie, on the other hand, took care of the house and the children. She worked in the fields and the garden. She milked the cows, and she slaved in all possible ways to bring Uncle Jonathan's prayers to fruition. She was generous to family and neighbors and admired by everyone. My mother particularly remembered one Christmas morning during her childhood that was destined to be a grim one. Weather had been dry all summer, and the money crops had failed. And after much careful nurturing, the garden had finally produced enough food. So that was not a problem. After the canning and preserving had been done, the pig and the cow were slaughtered, along with the occasional turkey and chicken. Aunt Laurie and Uncle Jonathan and their family were dinner guests that Christmas, and my mother said she had been warned that no gift were planned. She had received a homemade dress and a small sack of candy and an orange in her stocking that Christmas morning. When Aunt Laurie arrived, however, she brought gifts for all the children. She gave my mother a rag doll she'd made with beautifully embroidered facial features, and it wore a colorful dress. My mother was thrilled, and I was glad she was able to tell Aunt Laurie during that last visit how much that doll had meant to her. Not long after her visit, my mother received word that Aunt Laurie had died. I think she mourned for her more than most of the blood relatives she'd lost. It seems that angels appear when they are needed most, even if they're sometimes mistaken for witches. Now, on a cold winter's day when I do not need or want to go out, I sometimes commune with the dead. I'm not a spiritualist, but I do enjoy visiting with those relatives I knew and those who lived before my time. I rummage through the old trunk of my bedroom to get the box of pictures, and then get out some of the documents and clippings that I've collected. I've had to work to get to know those ancestors who lived before my parents. Grandpa and Grandma Rowe first. I knew you, Grandma, when you were all crippled up in a wheelchair. And Grandpa lifted you from the bed to the chair, and it frightened me when you whimpered in pain. We surely could belt out those cowboy songs together, though, after you had surgery and spent the winter with us. I know you must have missed your twin sister, who died in early childhood of cholera infantum. I have a letter you wrote a girlfriend in 1890. You were quite different then, a strong-minded young woman with an independent streak, and nobody could dictate whether you could join the Salvation Army or not. You were a sincere woman, even though you did not particularly like the street singing. I wonder if I ever told you how much I enjoyed the book of paper dolls you sent me one Christmas. And did you ever know about the scolding I got on the way home? After we visited that year I was 7, I had written you that we could not come to see you because we needed a new car and we were too hard up to buy a new one. You laughed and teased Mom about being hard up. How was I to know that my parents were proud and that people never admitted they were hard up, even if they were? After all, I only repeated the words they used. And good-natured roly-poly Grandpa, you look like Teddy Roosevelt to me, only more handsome. Your farm was a magical place, and I loved the smell of the cow barn and the wonderful fun jumping from the rafters into the hay mows. You were a caring and devoted husband who lifted Grandma around for many years, and you even took her to Florida to see if she felt better in a warmer climate. So what if you like to take a nip or two or three in your late years? You deserved it. Maybe it relieved some of the loneliness after she died. What a tiny woman you were, Grandma Brunais, and those dark, snapping eyes. I don't look a bit like you, but I would love to have known you. You died at 29 of typhoid fever after you helped a relative care for her husband. That was a tragedy. Grandpa Brunais, I remember seeing you only a few times, and you always had a scowl on your face. One clear memory is your angry voice saying, "Don't touch that." It had taken me so long to get up the courage to reach out one finger to touch that little stuffed bird in your parlor. I was always afraid of birds, but that one looked non-threatening. You taught me how not to be remembered by my grandchildren. What caused you to be so unlovable? You came from a prosperous family and inherited a beautiful farm. Your daughter and sons lost their mother when they were so young. I know you had a shred of sentimentality. Remnants of the peonies you planted on your young wife's grave were there when I visited once. Did guilt feelings haunt you when your oldest took her own life? Her brothers were devastated. Dad's Uncle Bill Libengood described you this way. Jess was meaner than hell, but he run a good farm. Aunt Mattie, the second wife of my grandfather, thank you for being one of my godmothers. I found it out only when I ran across my christening card. I'm sorry I don't remember you at all. It must have been a rude shock as a maiden lady to find yourself a stepmother to 5 rowdy boys. Great-Grandma Knapp, mother of my crippled grandmother, you died a couple of months before I was born, and maybe that's why I feel such a special connection to you. You look stern in your picture, but I know you had a lively sense of humor, though, because my mother and even my dad told me so much about you. I would like to have seen you throw a stick of kindling at your grandson after he pinched your behind. Orphaned as a child, Grandpa Knapp, you and your brother were reared by neighbors. My dad told me you could put together the frame of the side of a barn on the ground, and that when the crew raised it, they were so accurate it fit all the other sections perfectly. You walked miles to church carrying your shoes and only put them on at the door. You were a blacksmith and an inventor. How did you become literate enough to buy and read the novels of the time? I still have your copies of Les Miserables and The Man in the Iron Mask. I found in the On-A-Way Outlook your account of your trip to the University of Michigan Hospital in 1900. That was for an undisclosed ailment, but your purpose was to inform your neighbors that they needn't fear to go themselves if it became necessary, because you were treated like family while there. So many train and interurban connections you had to make, as well as the first and last leg by a team of horses to get to Ann Arbor and back. The cost of all the consultations and treatment for about 2.5 days was $3.60. Quite a bargain, I'd say. Great-Grandpa Libengood. You didn't live to be old, but I admire your courage. You told your wife to take a shovel and hit you in the head if you threatened to harm her or the children in one of your spells. You told your son to take an iron wedge and place it on your aching tooth and then hit it with a wooden mallet. I wonder what you said when the wedge went all the way through the side of your cheek. I know you fashioned a pair of pliers especially for pulling teeth shortly after that. Great-Grandma Libengood, I think you're the most colorful of all my ancestors. You had 11 children, and you suffered so much grief when 3 of your children died tragically. You were a very religious woman who served as a community nurse, and you were known throughout the region as Aunt Mary Jane. You had a vast knowledge of herbs and folk medicine, and you were an accomplished midwife. And you had a keen sense of humor. After Great-Grandpa Liebengood died, you ran the farm, and your sons did exactly as you said. You deserve more time to be remembered, so I'll wait until another day. Back you go into the trunk. Onaway, a small town about 50 miles south of the Straits of Mackinac, was the place of my mother's birth. It was her home until she married my father, who moved to the area when he was a young man. Both sets of grandparents, the Rose and the Brunaisers, owned farms about a quarter of a mile apart, and they lived on the road that led out of Onaway towards Black Lake. And I have such pleasant memories of visiting the farms of my maternal grandparents, and an uncle and an aunt and several cousins during my childhood. The barn with its cows and horses and huge hay mows was a wonderful place to play, and there were ladders to climb that provided jumping off places where we landed in the dry, sweet-smelling hay. And there were horse stalls and special rooms for calves and pigs and several outbuildings, and there were plenty of hiding places where we played hide and seek. One of the things I did that made me feel very important was going after the cows in the late afternoon. They had to be found first, then driven down the lanes to the barn for the afternoon milking. And milking a cow was fun. All by hand, of course. Grandfather Brunaiser had already left his farm and moved back to Ohio in the days of visit of my other grandparents and family. The Brunaiser farm was rented by a family named Wheeler, and my mother's sister married one of the sons of that family, Carmen. Carmen had a couple of younger sisters, and I visited them sometimes. And I got to explore the house where my dad had lived with his father and his stepmother, and his brothers. It was large, having 2 stairways, one from the kitchen and one from the living room. The latter was beautiful. It had wide steps and white decorative railings, and Dad and his brothers had not been allowed to use those stairs. The house also had a hidden room. From one of the upstairs closets we climbed up into what was, in fact, a very large attic. What an adventure it was to climb up there and snoop into old trunks, look at old photographs, and sit in quaint chairs. Black Lake was only a short distance away, and we went there to swim. The water was always cold, and the beach where we swam was stony. My maternal grandmother, crippled from rheumatoid arthritis, saved nickels and dimes, and she bought a lot on that lake. Unfortunately, during the Depression, she and my grandfather couldn't pay the taxes, and they lost it. I can only imagine the cost of a lot there now. I recall being there one time on the 4th of July. A rich man owned a large span of property on Black Lake, and every 4th of July he provided fresh ice cream to everyone who came into Onaway. Times were hard then, and many people never had ice cream any other time. The anticipation of the treat seemed to overshadow the celebration. For many years, of all the relatives who lived in or around Onaway, and those who moved around and away, I remained the oldest still living. That includes my grandfather Rose's sister, Aunt Elisha, and my grandmother Rose's sister, Aunt Rill, and her descendants, and others that I remember. When I count all those people, I'm astonished. Which brings to mind a special Christmas cactus, cuttings of which had been passed down from one of my maternal ancestors. Boisterous, shocking pink blooms dazzle me this morning, dispelling any inclination I might have had towards gloom. Because if winter storm progresses, I smile and say to myself, "Look, great-grandmother, grandmother, mother, and sister, see the rebirth of your Christmas cactus in all its glory." My plant is a descendant of the one belonging to Sarah Catherine Knapp, the first person whom I am silently addressing. She died in March of 1927, 2 months before I was born. Because of the proximity of her death and my birth, I have felt a special connection to her. My mother's face radiated when she spoke of this kindly pioneer woman who loved to raise flowers indoors and out. I almost believed I knew her too. Sarah rooted a Christmas cactus from the parent plant for her daughter, my grandmother, who did the same for my mother. My sisters and I were given slips from our mother's plant, and soon my daughters and nieces will also be recipients. I'm not sure from whom my great-grandmother obtained her cactus. I like to imagine that her mother sent it to her in the 1860s, and that's when she left Lenawee County, Michigan. She was bound for a wilderness home near Onaway in the northern part of Michigan's lower peninsula. Perhaps my great-great-grandmother brought the plant with her when she left New Jersey with a band of pioneers. They traveled on the Erie Canal, and then by a team of horses and wagons to settle in southwestern Michigan in the early part of the 19th century. Before that, maybe a slip of the plant crossed the Atlantic to the New World. I know I'm fantasizing, but the fact I know for certain is that mine is a descendant of that of Sarah Knapp, my great-grandmother. I thank my hardy ancestors, and I cherish their gifts of sound body and strong spirit. Moreover, since my Christmas cactus carries the genes of a living entity that my female ancestors touched, tended, and enjoyed, I am grateful for that connection also. If souls of the living and dead are able to cross whatever barriers separate them, I am certain that my grandmother's mothers and sisters are harmoniously tuned to mine as we admire the striking beauty of my resurrected, blossoming Christmas cactus on this dreary winter morning. You've been listening to Jacqueline Brunais' book, On the Drop Side of Yonder. It's filled with memories of her growing up time in the 1930s and 40s.